Professor Powell, thank you very much for coming to Texas and joining the Poverty Law Conference.
Oh, not at all. It's my pleasure to be here.
And thank you for sitting down and answering some questions with me. I appreciate that. Stuff, whether that's public benefits or unpaid wages or all the other stuff that legal aid attorneys get for their clients.
Well, I guess I see a couple of things. One is that, first of all, they have to continue to do that. And I would consider that what I call transactional, sort of saying, here's the system, it's set up this way. We need to make sure that to the extent that we have these opportunities, we use them. But we also have to acknowledge that these opportunities are inadequate, and many of them actually is going to get worse rather than better. And so part of the thing is, how do you, because in a sense, I would argue that you're not just trying to get your client stuff, you're trying to get your client, but the stuff you're trying to get your client really is belongingness and respect. And that if you get that, then many of those other things will take care of themselves. If you don't get that, there'll always be, even if you win the lawsuit or the hearing, it'll be begrudgingly, and at some point, those with power and influence will start chipping away. You think about the farm workers' action, where they eventually said, no class action suits against, or most people forget that early legal services did a lot of stuff around voting rights, did stuff around school desegregation, did stuff around, and after years of really impressive victories, they said, the elite went back to Congress and said, we want to change these regulations. And so it's important to sort of have a more comprehensive view and sort of looking at the trends. Or when they would say you can't represent, quote unquote, undocumented illegal aliens. So I think that you have to do both. You have to continue to do what you're doing, but also think about where do you, if the problem really is a sense of these people don't belong, how do you actually start, some, not everybody, but can you think about that in structuring your work consistently?
What advice would you give to a legal aid attorney who, as you pointed out in your presentation, is probably overwhelmed with a very large caseload, working long hours to do the transactional work within the system that you talked about, and how, while they're doing that, they might start to move towards also identifying those pressure points in the system that you talked about and that you urge the audience to address to affect systemic change?
Well, I think two things. One, I think it's hard to do at the individual level, so individual legal aid attorney or paralegal will have difficulty doing that, but you can probably structure a program to do that. I would also advise getting in touch with programs that have been on the cusp of doing that. So, but yeah, we've done work with Massachusetts Legal Aid, we've done work with Connecticut, we've done work with Sacramento. So there are legal aid groups that have actually, at the institutional level, taken this on. Because part of what, and it's not that the transactional is bad and it shouldn't be done. In fact, the transactional, if done right, gives you a look at what's happening at the systemic level. So to give you an example, there was a group in Chicago that was doing foreclosure work. And it noticed after a while that its work had ticked up. And so no client was coming in saying, our whole community is being steered towards subprime loans. But so one of the things you do when you look at a system is you look at patterns. But looking at patterns means you have to look at things, right? And so the person who's having the direct contact with clients has to have both the ability and the sensitivity to see patterns that the client may never notice in herself. And once you see those patterns, it might suggest that something else is happening. And in terms of foreclosure is a good example because, at least in most communities, if you just focus at the foreclosure level, you're never going to catch up. Because you can move upstream and either get something, not even just a moratorium, because the problem is much deeper than that. And what I was suggesting in my talk is that the problem, if we're not careful, will get worse. And it will not just make it harder for the legal aid attorney, but will make it much worse for the client. So how do we actually free up some time, resources to think about, to both notice those patterns and then think about ways of intervening upstream?
in your presentation, you often frame things in something of an economic frame, demand and supply, and making sure you're not increasing demand without addressing the disparities in supply. For example, in Massachusetts with the healthcare. That might be very different from the frame that most lawyers are trained in, and the law talks about state and citizen or plaintiff defendant. Mm-hmm. What role do you see for the traditional legal frame and the targeted universalism that you laid out in your presentation?
Well, first of all, again, as I said in my presentation, targeted universalism is the idea that our goals should be universal. Our strategies, our path should be targeted. I think that actually fits well within the legal frame. It's actually a communication strategy, but it's also an application strategy. And it starts moving the needle in the right direction. So, for example, a lot of times we're sort of taught to think in terms of just disparities. So you could say, at one point, I think these numbers are approximately right, but about 70% of whites or 75% of whites had decent health care, and for blacks and Latinos, it might have been in the 40s or even high 30s. So one goal would be in that disparity. But there are a lot of ways of ending that disparity. You could sort of say, let's get to the happy middle. Everybody, 60% of the people have health care. Where I don't think that's really the goal. And also, if there's a sense, especially in society where there's all this anxiety economically, but also culturally and even at a deeper level, if one group feels like you're going to take something from them to give to another group, that's a dead letter. I mean, whether you can win at a court hearing or not, it's not going to be sustainable in terms of the larger body politics. But if you can basically say, look, everybody deserves decent health care. In order to get that number to where you want it to be for the white community, it might mean a 25% uptick. For the black and Latino community, it might mean a 50 or 40% uptick. That's fine. And people can actually embrace that. You're not taking from them one group to give to another group. You're saying, it's not fair that none of us have this. The same with education. Everybody should have a decent education. I'm not trying to take from you. And I think it's hard to appreciate, especially, frankly, for an advocate on behalf of poor people, and especially poor people of color and poor communities of color, that the middle class is feeling under tremendous pressure and anxiety as well, which doesn't naturally lead them to be generous. And so if we frame things in terms of either or, I win, you lose. And the reality is, in many cases, regardless of what the laws say, they may have more power, even to the point of being able to get the law changed. So we have to really change that frame.
And to follow up on that, what is the goal? So you advocate for addressing the system, moving the system. Where is it moving to? So, for example, with Ms. Williams-Bolar in the video you showed, she wanted to get up and move to a different part of the system. And given that it is all functioning as a system, the end product has to be something different than just that one part writ large. I mean, the whole thing has to be different than anything that's existing now. So what do you see as the system that shows up in the end, given that it's going to be different than anything that we see now?
Yeah, I guess I would say a couple of things. One, the system has to, a big piece of it is a system where people throughout the system have a sense of belonging, where the institutions serve our best goals and best values. I think is a huge step forward. And I think that would produce better, tangible outcomes as well. And so we want to have, part of the problem is that we sort of think in terms of the way things are, and we do think in terms of largely economic models as opposed to democratic models, as opposed to models where we have sort of a collective future, where our futures are intertwined. How do we do that in a real way? So everyone wants a child to go to a safe school, and everyone wants a child to go to school where he or she has a good chance of learning. And ultimately, people want to have a voice in their community, in their lives, in their world. That radical idea is what we call democracy. And in a democracy, there's an assumption, sometimes not stated, that we're all equal partners, that we all have rights and we all have responsibilities, but as members. And so I think really animating that becomes significant, but not animating it just in a 30,000 feet on an abstract level, but think about what would that mean for our institutions, what would that mean for our structures, what would it mean, for example, in terms of, you can't have a democracy that's really robust where you have trillions of dollars being paid for by the corporate elite. That's something that has, I think, corrosive implications, not just for low-income people, it's corrosive effect of democracy, period. And as that corrosive effect takes place, it's likely, if we're not careful, for the shrinking middle class to turn their wrath onto poor people, as opposed to saying there's something structurally wrong here. So that's part of it, I think. And I think those pressures will only increase as we become, like I said, more racially, economically, religiously diverse. But also we have a small group of institutes and people that really sit outside of the body politics, or they sit above it, which is antithetical to at least the vision of what the country is supposed to be like when we begin.
So given all that, what are your top legal and political priorities? What are those pressure points that you're hoping to move in the next, say, 5 years?
Well, when we talk about segregation, segregation is a way of ordering and sorting people in relation to opportunity. Segregation is not simply separating people by race or by nationality or by language. It's a way of actually distributing opportunity. And it's fundamentally corrosive both to the people and to our larger society. And so I see a continued need to sort of rethink in a much more radical way what would a society look like that's fair and inclusive and people can participate. And what would the institutions look like? And institutions you can think of as the skeleton of society, which we don't pay enough attention to. And I do think that the role of corporations in that is actually quite significant. It's not surprising to me, for example, that the subprime crisis was driven by a very small segment of society that had the impact of actually almost bringing the whole world economy to its knees. We haven't really reconfigured that at all. We still have that population sitting above society. Understanding what that means in real terms, I think is quite significant. So I think that really paying attention to the work our structures are doing in terms of distributing opportunity, not naturalizing those, which we have a tendency to do. So we see things and we think that's the way it is, that's always the way it's been, that's always what it's going to be. And none of those are true. It's not the way it always was, it's not the way it has to be, and it certainly is going to be different. But it's different in response to our needs, a difference in response to the needs of a few. I also think, we need a different, and this is probably harder to some extent, but we need a different framework to think about globalization. The anxiety that we feel in the United States is not simply because of the pressure on the middle class and pressure on the poor, all that's true, but it's also our different role in it. And I understand that poverty is partially about maybe you don't have enough, whatever you, but it's really about not having enough respect and
Well, Professor Powell, thank you very, very much for sitting down with me.
Appreciate it.